By now, if it wasn't obvious, the GeForce 6 line is one of my all-time favorite series of graphics cards. Going back to my teenage years, a GeForce 6800 was my first sort of high-end graphics card. And since then, I've owned, many different cards in this line. And on this channel, I've covered the GeForce 6 series in several of my videos. It just has a strong personal connection to me. A lot of nostalgia associated with it, and a fascinating history from the lows of the GeForce FX series and to, sort of a comeback. Back when NVIDIA was not the all-encompassing giant multi-trillion-dollar company that they are today, but back when they were a little scrappier, they had to fight a little more when they're focused just on gaming and making PC gamers happy with quality parts, and that's exactly what they did with the GeForce 6 series. At this point, though, I sort of assumed I knew everything there was to know about the GeForce 6 line, other than maybe some really, really low-level technical stuff that would only be relevant to a programmer, let's say. But recently, I ran across something I didn't know anything about, and it was one of the craziest discoveries I've made in years, and I'm here to talk about it with you today. This is PixelPipes. NVIDIA's GeForce 6 series launched in April 2004, with the flagship headliner, of course, being the GeForce 6800 Ultra. And then within a few months, you had a full range of GeForce 6 series cards, from the lower-end GeForce 6200 cards and their variants, the mid-range 6600s, and even in the high-end space, the 6800 Ultra was joined by several other cards, and what I can only describe is more or less a sub-series of 6800 cards within the family. Pretty much from launch, you had the GeForce 6800, the GeForce 6800 GT, alongside the Ultra, to cover three different price points in sort of the high-end space. And they all had advantages and disadvantages. Really with the GT, you're looking at more or less close to the performance of the flagship Ultra, just with a compromise in terms of clock speed. Very typically, this was small enough that users could overclock their GTs to mimic the performance of a Ultra version. But the 6800 was cut down significantly more. This actually had 4 of its PixelPipes disabled. The flagship cards had 16 PixelPipes, this only had 12. And it also had one of its vertex shaders disabled as well. 5 out of the 6 were enabled. You had half as much VRAM, 128 megabytes, and it was slower. DDR1 memory running at 700 megahertz effectively, versus 1 gigahertz or 1.1 gigahertz for the higher end cards using the latest GDDR3 memory standard. Nonetheless, this card was fast enough to easily surpass the flagship cards of the previous generation, literally just a year apart. It was a crazy time when the flagship performance of previous generation cards were easily surpassed by even modestly priced cards the next generation. It's honestly mind-blowing to reflect back on how quickly technology progressed back in those days. But NVIDIA wasn't quite done yet with the 6800 variants. A little later on in 2004, NVIDIA would release the GeForce 6800 LE, which cut the number of PixelPipes further to 8 and reduced the vertex shaders down to 4. And this was meant to be priced somewhere around the $200 mark or so to compete in the mid-range market. Now, of course, there was considerable overlap with a card like that and, say, the 6600 GT. And in many cases, the 6600 GT, which also had 8 pixel pipes, was faster than the 6800 LE just because the clocks were so much higher. The main advantage of the 6800 LE was that it retained the full 256-bit memory interface of the other 6800 line cards. So while the memory was still DDR1, it was clocked lower. The 6600 GT was clocked anywhere between 900 megahertz effectively and 1 gigahertz with the use of GDDR3. So there wasn't a huge gap in between them in terms of memory bandwidth, whereas the core clock at 500 megahertz made at least the texture fill rate, the pixel performance, and the vertex shading performance substantially higher with the 6600 GT. Then a little bit later on, in 2005, NVIDIA would launch the GeForce 6800 XT. And as far as I can tell, there really wasn't any major differences between the XT and the LE. NVIDIA and ATI at that point were kind of poking fun at each other in terms of their name conventions. So NVIDIA released a sort of lower-end 6800 card under XT, which is what ATI used for their high-end cards. And conversely, ATI released a lower-end X800 GT to poke fun at NVIDIA's naming convention. And, you know, there were quite a few different variants. Of course, the 6800 series did transition to PCI Express, having launched on AGP initially. And, you know, a lot of it was the same cards, just bridged over to PCI Express. And there were even some variants like the NV41 and NV42, which were native PCI Express as well. So, you know, there was a lot, and I do mean a lot, of different 6800 cards when you combine both the sets of AGP with the sets of PCI Express. But then it gets more complicated because then add-in board partners tended to add their own sort of flavor to their cards, and it seemed almost like they had quite a bit of leeway in this regard. For example, ASUS released a version of the original 6800, but using GDDR3 memory, kind of blurring the lines a little bit between that card and the GT, but still with the 12 pixel pipes. But ASUS would also go the other direction with their 6800 variants, with releasing lower-end ones, such as this fairly notorious variant that they put out probably in 2005. And I'm going to need to change that cap there, probably all of them. It has a very interesting arrangement of memory chips. Typically, the memory chips are sort of arranged around the GPU in sort of a curved fashion. But in this case, they're straight across and down. And besides how they're arranged, there's also quite a bit more memory on this card than your typical 6800. This card has a whopping 512 megabytes of VRAM, which might make it seem like a great bargain. I mean, this variant was actually priced cheaper than your typical 6800, or at least slightly cheaper. But you know, the memory size is deceiving because, for one thing, 512 megabytes memory is an excessive amount for a card of this level of performance. It's way more than it would ever need. But it comes with a huge trade-off. This card is using a 128-bit memory interface. So, unlike all the other 6800 cards, this has the memory bandwidth cut in half at the bus. But it gets worse than that. This memory is also using DDR2, clocked at a whopping 533 megahertz effectively, significantly lower than the 700 megahertz effectively for a standard 6800, which, by the way, again, has double the memory bus width. Yeah, in order to pack an absolutely ludicrous amount of VRAM on this card, they had to go slow with the memory on top of cutting the memory bus. And this sort of deceptive practice may make you think that you are getting a card that performs at the level of other 6800s with just more memory, unless you are savvy enough to understand the differences that memory bandwidth can make on a GPU. And unfortunately, not a lot of people were that savvy. I'm sure this sold decently well. And yeah, pretty unscrupulous of ASUS at that time, I have to say. Some things never change, I guess. And for the longest time, I felt like this was probably one of the strangest variants of the 6800. In fact, I intended to make a video on this card specifically for a long time now. In fact, a couple of GPU Junes ago, I actually sent this to Rick's Random Retro for him to play with as, I wouldn't say it was a prank, but it was just good fun to see what he made of the card. And we had a good time on that stream. But there was something else that I ran across that made me halt on that idea, at least for a little while. And if you thought that this was potentially the worst 6800 card ever made, well, there was a company out there that said, hold my beer. The name of that company is BioStar. They're one of those companies that's been around for a while, sort of in the budget realm, making gaudy looking motherboards for much of their existence, but they also make graphics cards, of course. And they released a variant of the 6800 XT, which I managed to find not too long ago. Now, this actually also uses DDR2 memory, only 128 megabytes though. But what looks off about this card? What's missing here? Maybe missing RAM, missing memory. This might look like somebody used this card for parts and just harvested chips off of it. But I kid you not, this card was sold like this. And I'll put a picture of the Newegg product listing on the screen. Thankfully, Newegg keeps product pages going back decades, which is really handy for situations like this when you have a card whose very existence is rather unbelievable. Yeah, they actually released this card like this. And what's significant about this is that the missing memory has many connotations to the configuration of this card. It's not just that, oh, it's got 128 megs instead of 256 or 512. No, it goes much, much further than that. Let's talk a little bit about how memory is connected to the GPU on a typical graphics card of this era. Typically, the GPU, which has an integrated memory controller, is connected directly to its memory chips via channels. In this case, you have pairs of chips on each channel, at least on the front of this card, but we'll get to more on that later. And each chip is 32 bits. That's how many physical bits are supported by the pins or these bumps on the underside of each of these chips. So they're 32-bit each. A pair of these gets you a 64-bit memory channel. So 4 pairs would be a 256-bit memory interface. If you take away physical chips, you take away channels of memory, leaving you with just whatever's left. In this case, 2 chips, 64 bits. This card has a 64-bit memory interface. Flipping around to the back side, you see also there's another set of chips on the back. And really this is just dual ranking, so to say. You have twice the number of chips on each channel, but you still have a 64-bit memory interface. And if you look on the back, on the sticker, that's confirmed, 128 megabytes, 64-bit DDR2. Like other 1600 XTs, it has 8 PixelPipes, 4 vertex shaders, and has a core clock of 325 megahertz. Mercifully, BioStar did clock the memory at 700 megahertz effectively. That's small consolation when you have a 64-bit memory interface. So on paper, this is without a doubt the most terrible variant of the 6800 series ever made. And I don't think we need to do any testing to confirm that. That being said, I'm going to do some testing to confirm that. Our nerfed 6800 and 6800 XT will be receiving their brutal takedown via a selection of 3 other cards. The first, of course, will be a proper GeForce 6800 with the full 256-bit memory interface, and also be using Riva Tuner to disable 4 of its PixelPipes and 1 of its vertex shaders, and clocking the core to 300 MHz to simulate the AGP variant of the 6800 LE. We'll also throw in an AGP 6600 GT for some added context for what was available in the mid-range segment at the time. Though keep in mind, I do prefer to have the memory clocked to the full 1 GHz effective speed in line with the original PCI Express version, which I've done here. And yes, I recapped the ASUS 6800 before starting the tests. Full specs for each card can be compared here, so feel free to pause the video if you want to look more closely. Pay particular attention to memory bandwidth here. We'll start with a legacy test just so we can see how texture and pixel fill rates in relation to memory bandwidth affect a mostly shader-free scenario. The breakdown of the results appears to mostly be affected by the latter, with performance favoring the cards with more bandwidth rather than more pipes. The slight exception goes to the 6600 GT, which barely edges out the 6800 LE despite having less bandwidth. 3D Mark 03 behaves largely the same, although the 6600 GT performs comfortably ahead of the 6800 LE this time, indicating a bit more of an emphasis on core throughput. The 6800 XT and its hobbled 64-bit memory bus is performing truly abysmally, in line with, say, a FX 5700 Ultra rather than a next-generation card. With 3D Mark 05 putting more weight on shader performance, we see the 6800 LE and the 128-bit 6800 evening out. The loss of bandwidth still hugely reduces the 128-bit card's performance compared to a normal 6800, but the 12 pipe somewhat makes up for it compared to the 8-pipe 6800 LE. The 6800 XT does better than any FX card here, but only barely, and that's not saying much. In the Aqua Mark III benchmark, memory bandwidth accounts for much less, and we actually see the 128-bit 1600 eke ahead of the 1600 LE by a couple hundred points. The 6600 GT also has a healthy lead in front of the normal 1600, which is surprising. The 1600 XT, however, is really beyond help here, well behind everything else. UT 2004 is another legacy-style test, but it puts less emphasis on memory bandwidth than 3D Mark 01 did. The normal 6800 and 6600 GT are dead even once again, and well ahead of the other cards. The 128-bit 1600 is even with the 1600 LE, and the 1600 XT is back there in Suckland. Halo is another that puts more emphasis on shader performance, and here we see the cards are much tighter together. The 128-bit 1600 doesn't lose as much as you would expect next to a 256-bit 1600, and the 64-bit 1600 XT performs somewhat close to the 1600 LE. Painkiller, with the resolution cranked up, puts a bit more weight towards bandwidth again, and the results hash out accordingly. The 1600 XT might be the slowest, but it looks pretty playable here, that is, until you actually play the game, which for whatever reason tells a completely different story. Time demos, unfortunately, aren't always perfect. Now, the results for Half-Life 2 are a little bonkers. Despite having nearly the same throughput, the higher clock 6600 GT still pulls out ahead of the vanilla 1600. I have a theory to do with that and the Curie architecture's abnormal ability to scale with clock speed, but that will be something to test in the future. That aside, the 128-bit 1600 performs comfortably ahead of the 1600 LE despite having much less bandwidth, and the 1600 XT loses surprisingly little performance compared to the LE. But let's turn things up a bit with the Half-Life 2 Lost Coast demo, which lowers the frame rates across the board a bit, but otherwise we're still talking about the same weird results that Half-Life 2 was getting. Again, bandwidth matters little, as the 128-bit 1600 does a little better compared to the 1600 LE in this test than in previous ones, but it still loses a lot compared to a full-speed 6800. Far Cry likes memory bandwidth a little more, with the vanilla 6800 slightly ahead of the 6600 GT and the 6800 LE a little ahead of the 128-bit 6800. Unsurprisingly, the 6800 XT falls way behind. Doom 3 behaves almost identically to Far Cry, although the 1% lows are quite a bit lower for all the cards here, really only being manageable on the two fastest cards. For Torture Test, I loaded up Fear, which doesn't perform great on any of these cards, largely because my settings here go beyond the 128MB frame buffer of most of them. If you look at this footage I captured on the 512MB 1600, it gets all the way up to 201 megs, which is probably why the 1% lows on that card are nearly the same as the faster cards. Then, averaging the 8 games tested, we see that overall the 6800LE and 128-bit 6800 performed very similarly to each other. The normal 6800 and 6600 GT are far ahead of the pack, and also largely even with each other. The 64-bit 6800 XT performs roughly half as well as the fastest cards, emphasizing just how much this poorly equipped NV40 has lost from its memory configuration alone. So, now that we've seen the results, at least the question that comes to my mind is why? Why did these two cards exist? What was the reason for it? Why even make them? I mean, these are both using a full NV40 die underneath these coolers, and yet they are severely performance hampered by their memory configurations. And this one being the most egregious. This one boggles my mind. It's honestly almost impressive how much of a kind of a ripoff this card is. I mean, yes, it does say on the back, on the sticker, and in the Newegg listing that I showed that it was a 64-bit card, but you're not going to know that if you're not deeply invested in PC hardware or graphics cards, or you're extremely knowledgeable and well read on the stuff. And as we saw, you know, not having that knowledge could result in you buying a card like this with a severely hampered experience. I mean, this is like trying to drive a semi-truck through a plastic straw. This is one of the most terrible graphics cards I've ever come across. A complete abomination, quite honestly. On a list of awful things, this fits somewhere in between a backed up septic tank and pineapple on pizza, which those two things are really close together. This just slots just in that tiny little sliver between the two. It's incredibly bad. Almost nothing ran right on this card. If the performance wasn't just simply hampered, a lot of times we'd have weird stuttering and odd frame pacing issues. And then there were even applications that just downright crashed. I mean, 3D Mark 06, the reason it wasn't in this test, it crashes on this card. So yeah, I have to imagine this card is so bad and its configuration is so far outside what the NV40's design was intended to be that it is almost broken. In fact, this card did actually come to me completely broken. That's why you see some spotty soldering back here. I had to replace that coil and also add another one up here just to get this thing to turn on. But as terrible as this card is, I am glad I could revive it, kicking and screaming back to the living world for all of us to jeer and mock and sneer at. Because, yeah, the story deserves to be told about this card, honestly. And though I'm putting a lot of emphasis on this one, let's not forget the Asus card here. Now, to be fair, Asus was not the only one to release a card like this. I had a couple others pointed out to me on the Pixel Talk Discord server. Someone else has another 128-bit card using presumably the same chip. And so, unfortunately, this was not an isolated occurrence, which is really astonishing in a way, given that, performance is pretty bad. Now, you might say it's usable. Like, okay, some of the games, they performed okay. It even performed very similarly to a 6800 LE. The problem I have with that is the deception. We see this a lot in modern times, but to brandish this as a 6800, yet coming with a completely gimped memory configuration, is a huge disservice, a hugely dishonest practice for consumers. And, it's kind of shameful. Now, is there any point in getting up in arms about something that happened literally 20 years ago? Maybe not. I mean, some people make a YouTube career doing stuff like that. I don't necessarily intend to myself, but I don't know. I guess it's still kind of offensive, even though we're so far beyond that time-wise, that, you know, these cards are sold alongside things like a 6600 GT and, you know, the full speed 6800, or even the 6800 LE, which was, you know, considerably cheaper than either of these, and performing, you know, no worse in the case of the 6800 LE, but certainly way better in the case of these two cards. I mean, especially the 6600 GT. I mean, you could get even, you know, the regular 6600, and that would perform better than this one, for example, and probably this one as well. There were just so many way better options, but they were marketing these cards on that 6800 name. You know, the higher number must be better, right? I mean, they're preying on people's I don't want to say ignorance, but just their lack of knowledgeability. And unfortunately, examinations like this of history are sometimes important to do when viewed through a modern lens, in a modern context. This is something that still happens today. You still have, say for example, 8GB and 16GB cards sold under the same name with vastly different performance characteristics. It's not quite as extreme as we're seeing here with memory buses cut in half or cut to a fourth of the full speed. But we did see not too long ago, you know, cards with DDR4 memory with severely gimped performance compared to other ones with GDDR5. Like, it happens, it will continue to happen. This is nothing new. And clearly we see that this has been going on for a long time. I don't mean to get all up in arms necessarily and ranty in this video, although I pretty much already have, but really I just wanted to talk about this card especially and show everyone what a crime to GPUs that the existence of this card is. And I hope you at least got some entertainment out of it. Anyway, that will do it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Nathan, and this has been PixelPipes.